I was born to South African parents in Botswana, which is a little country above South Africa. My parents had left South Africa in their early 20s due to being frustrated by the very conservative and quite perverse situation of both the apartheid system and government, but also family dynamics that they were both deeply unhappy with. So they exited South Africa. They weren't able to go much further than other African countries. And so they moved from one to the next, and I'm one of 4 children. Each of us is born in a different African country, but all within the kind of Southern African region. And we returned to South Africa in the early 90s. It's interesting that it was a small part of my history in many ways, but that story of my birth has been one that's been told many times and is one that I know has informed my identity in many ways. I wasn't born in a hospital, for example. My mum was a midwife and somebody who was volunteering and helping Dutch Doctors Without Borders at the time. And so when she went into labor with me, she was actually outside of the little town of Francistown in an even more rural area. And she realized that I was coming and I was coming quickly, and she hadn't anticipated it. And so she gave birth to me with the help of one of the doctors there who delivered me essentially and remains a very important individual in my life, but in somebody else's self-built shack in a rural part of Botswana. And because my mother had such a close relationship with many of the women in this particular village and area, as she'd been helping them with their maternities and their own birth processes and caring for their babies, I was kind of very welcomed into that space and christened Mapula, which means Mother Rain, because shortly after my birth, it had begun to rain and there'd been a drought for some time before that. So there's this very kind of romantic story for a little white girl born in a village. And the first years of my life, I remained one of the only white children in a school of only Black children. And up until that point, I would say, like most children, I wasn't particularly aware of my race in relation to everybody else's. It was just home, it was how things were, and that was life for me. We moved and left Botswana in the early 90s with the major shifts happening in South Africa and the end of the era of apartheid, the release of individuals like Nelson Mandela, and the onset of the South African democracy, and came back to live in Johannesburg. Also because my parents felt that my older brothers in particular needed to have a more traditional form of education and the kinds of education that South Africa was able to offer. And that was the first time at the age of about 11 that I became aware of race, because I came back into a white-only school. And then I was sort of asking where the other children were. And I was confused by the lack of Black people, even though this is a country that is made up 90% of people of races other than white, in the context that I was exposed to, I was seeing only white people. And that was the success of the apartheid system in the way that it segregated and separated and oppressed people of other races. And so I then very quickly, though, became accustomed to that. In 1994, at the age of 14, there was the first democratic elections, and things started to shift, but in a very slow way, and remain in a very slow way in the context of a middle-class white South African. There was not any major change to our lives, the quality of our lives, the privileges that we enjoyed. And it was only until after my high school years that where I left South Africa and I went to work as a nanny, as a kind of gap year in Amsterdam, with my godfather, the Dutch doctor who delivered me, having organized a job with one of his colleagues in Amsterdam, that I started to become aware of the segregation that my teenage years had really meant. Because now I was living in Holland, and I was in Amsterdam itself, and I was moving around an inner city, a central business district, freely on a bicycle. And it occurred to me that I had never done that as a teenager, that I'd lived behind walls, that I had only been driven one place to another by parents who were very conscious of where we'd gone, and that I, as an 18-year-old, had never been to the inner city of my own city. And it was very strange. And it was only once out of that I recognized that weirdness. I spent 2 years in Europe, the first as a nanny in Amsterdam, and the second as a bar person in London. And I really had very little desire to go back to South Africa at that point. It was more a demand and a need and a desperation from my parents, who expected me to study. But it was also in that time that I recognized that I was going to be going into the arts, as I'd been exposed in my time in Amsterdam and London to a contemporary art scene. And that was by the wife of my godfather, my godmother, who is a musician and who exposed me to many different forms of work as regularly as she could. And I had always been told, the narrative that had been given to me from a small child until that point was that I was artistic, I was creative, I had a natural ability, but that these things were hobbies. These things were what would bring you some joy. These were ways to relax. They were ways to stay happy, but they were by no means things to be taken seriously or things to be worked on or pursued. They were things that happened to be a part of your makeup, that genetically you had somehow received a gift, an ability to sing and to draw. And it was, aren't you lucky? It makes you special, but only in that it's something that you have for yourself. It's not something that you give or that you grow or that you foster. And it was my time as an 18 and a 19-year-old in Europe that I realized, well, actually, there is this capacity that others have. There are these spaces, there are these large institutions that take this very seriously and support it. And it's clearly a life for many. So when I returned to South Africa, I announced that I was wanting to study art, and my parents were obviously confused and not particularly supportive of it, but at the same time knew that me coming back was already something that I didn't want to do. And so they said, all right, well, let's begin there and you'll probably change over and move into a more practical degree. And so I had 2 interviews. I applied for both a visual art degree, a fine art degree, and a drama degree, a dramatic BA. And I was accepted into both. And I would say that it was random, the selection at the end of the day. It came down to two interviews with 2 different individuals at the school of at the Witwatersrand Wits School, which was not at that point yet the School of the Arts. So they were 2 separate departments in different parts of the university even. But the reason I chose fine art in the end was because I enjoyed the conversation with the professor who interviewed me more than the conversation with the dramatic arts professor. So it was pretty random. It came down to somebody's personality rather than what I was really understanding or deeply desiring. And so that's where I did my degree. And in the course of my degree, I fell in love with a fellow student, and the 2 of us saw an opportunity to move into the inner city, which was the early 2000s, and we decided to move into an area called Doornfontein, which was really a kind of industrial building where small factories were operating. And we found out about a top floor that was for rent, and it was extremely cheap, and it wasn't residential, it was really not intended for living in, but we converted one of the showers into a toilet and brought our kind of gas cooker and moved in and decided we were going to occupy the inner city and live in the central business district like people do all over the world, and particularly like artists do. And that had a really big impact on my identity. And those years of doing my degree in a space that attracted a lot of other artists to use the space, we kind of became like a weird residency, hostel, unofficial system. And it was very interesting because that building was actually across the way from a building called August House. And in the time that we were there, August House established itself as an official art studio. And it is now home to, as studio spaces, to over 60 really significant visual artists living and working in Johannesburg. There was a kind of a particular energy around this part of the inner city that was notoriously dangerous, or one that you wouldn't easily navigate or move through, especially as a woman and especially on foot. So those are little kind of snippets of my backstory. But it comes to an important point where in 2010, I finished my degree. I've been practicing for some time. I've worked in different spaces. I've lived in that part of the city and then in another part of the city called Bronwyn. And I become aware of an opportunity to actually buy or work and live in a part of the city that is being rejuvenated. But that's the kind of positive marketing spin that you would put on a part of the city identified by a private developer to shift a previously industrial part of a city into a residential and a cultural precinct, because it's also been a project at one and the same of gentrification. And so in 2010, when I became aware of this development, I decided to get involved in it as an artist. And my partner and I, Marcus Neustetter, who's also an artist and has also been invested in working within the city had been invested in working in the city for many years. We started to try to show there and do little informal activations and performances. We got to know the developer, and he started to understand that he could continue to grow and cement this as a cultural precinct through collaborations with artists and exchanges and partnerships with artists. And so as two artists, we decided to base our lives there, and we moved into another space that was now converted officially into a residential home, and we based our studios and our practice in this east end of the Johannesburg inner city. And that's why by 2016, I was approached by William Kentridge to work with him in the founding of an arts space, which we came to call the Center for the Less Good Idea. So it's a kind of as I said, the sort of highlights and the peaks of the reasons why, like dominoes, I came to be this kind of advocate for and lover of the Johannesburg inner city, and why the Center for the Less Good Idea is also situated there, and how it functions within my understanding of myself as an individual and as an artist, and then what we hope collectively, the many people involved at the Center for the Less Good Idea, that the Center for the Less Good Idea can be in Johannesburg. Yeah, so that's not how I planned to start this lecture, but it's been a nice little recap even for myself. I think that what is important for me to mention at this point is, up until very recently, and from my degree up until very recently, I've understood myself primarily as a visual artist. But there was always an interest in me about storytelling and performativity. I come from a family of storytellers. Stories are regularly repeated. In our family, there are narratives that I don't know whether I actually remember them, or that they've just been told enough times for me to have conjured a visual memory of them. So storytelling is important, and performativity has been extremely important for me. The presence of the body in a lot of my work. Equally important, I have been interested in our relationship as human beings to death, and the lens that we have through death of what constitutes life. That relationship or those interests are quite clear to me as to why they exist. I happen to be the daughter of a nurse who began her nursing career as a midwife, and who delivered many, many babies into the world, who had 4 children of her own, and who is one of 14 children, one of the eldest of 14. And so by the age of 13, my mother was delivering her own siblings from her own mother. So there was this kind of deep embedded understanding of a birth process, and of what that passage into life constitutes. Interestingly, once we left other countries in Southern Africa, and my parents had sort of stopped their moving around and came back to live in South Africa and situate themselves back in the country of their own birth, my mom made a radical decision to shift from midwifing and from receiving and delivering babies into becoming a palliative specialist who was a nurse who would see people out of the last moments of their lives. So pain management and the passage of death became her focus. And she worked with hospice for the past 30 years. So death and its processes were equally a daily part of my life. I would listen to her on the phone, consoling families. I'd often be sitting in the car because she'd have picked me up from school and I'd be on my way to somewhere, an extramural or something. And she would say, she just needs to stop at this person's home because so-and-so is in their last moments. And so I would be waiting outside. She would be with the family, assisting them with that. And I would be knowing what was happening, but always on the kind of periphery. And so that's obviously informed a lot of the reasons as to why I've sought to find metaphorical and visual languages for the modes of thinking that constitute the ways in which we deal with death and the ways in which we understand life. And obviously, due to that, I'm interested in philosophy, I'm interested in literature, but I'm also very interested in biology and in physics and in religion, the modes of thinking that we generate as human beings to better comprehend what it is that we're doing here and the ways in which we function on this particular spinning planet in the middle of the galaxy that surrounds us. So there are two components to that question and that way of working and that particular interest for me. One is that I have an introspective, process-led studio practice. One that is very isolated and insular and needs to be that. Where in my own studio, I am pursuing a kind of making that slowly but surely reveals parts of my thinking, parts of my comprehension of self. But there's a sort of split personality because there's another part of my life and my practice and process, which is highly gregarious, very social, very collaborative, that intersects with kind of activism and outreach and community. And for a long time, I was unable to really find the relationship between these two individuals that exist within me. A lot of the time, I think that the reason I suspected I was more doing the gregarious, the community-led, the outreach and the kind of the practice that involved more than myself was because it was a solution to a means to an end. There were structures at play that allowed me to earn a living through different ways, and so that was something that I was assuming. Interestingly, though, as my own art career took off, and as I started to work with a gallery who was supporting me and giving me annual exhibitions that were selling well, and I was receiving certain commissions, and I would have technically been able to give up that kind of communal part of myself. There was a deeply embedded desire and momentum that struck, that where I realized that I needed that other part of my life. I needed that other part of self in order to be inspired. That was where the flow of information was coming from, and that was where I was in fact rooted, and it would always need to be a balance between the two. So moving into early 2016, when I got a call from William Kentridge, somebody I hadn't met before. Obviously, I knew of him. He's a significant figure in the South African art scene, and obviously also in the international art scene. You know, we'd been in the same room in different instances, but we'd never had a conversation. And so it was weird to get a call from him. But of course, he knew that I had been deeply sort of rooted in the Maboneng area, and it was an area that he also practiced out of, because in 2008 already, William had taken a sort of rather bizarre decision to buy an old factory and convert it into a larger studio. That decision catalyzed a process where the developer that I spoke about earlier recognized an opportunity. Somebody like William Kentridge, an international name in the arts, buying a studio in an area that was otherwise not particularly occupied by anything that was of the cultural industries, apart from this little collection of visual artist studios up the road, but actually officially not part of the area that has subsequently become Maboneng, which means place of light, and isn't the official name that the city gives it. The city officially calls the area that Maboneng is situated in city and suburban. And I think that says everything about how they feel about it. There was never a kind of urban geographer making a very deliberate plan about the way that this transitional city, the space in the city between the business district and the first residential area of Jeppies Town, how it would function. So William gave me a call and asked me for a meeting, and I agreed, of course, and went through to his home studio, and he asked me a very basic question. He said, "Do you think Johannesburg needs another sort of foundation for the arts? Do you think it needs a space where the arts can practice? Is it something that you think Johannesburg needs right now?" And of course, I thought, yes, Johannesburg absolutely needs that. But also in the back of my mind, I knew that there are so many places in Johannesburg, including the city museums, the Johannesburg art galleries, the theaters, the universities, that are in a sort of state of collapse and are really struggling to function, and who are surely are step by step being given less and less support by government, by the institutions set up to support arts and culture in the country. And so it was to say, well, what kind of institution would we build? What kind of space could we create that was able to eventually support these spaces that were in a state of crisis, and at the same time be free of what these spaces, the reasons these spaces are in crisis, the things that they have inherited, and the infrastructures that the enormously heavy bureaucracies that seem to be weighing these spaces down in their attempts to liberate themselves from a colonial and an apartheid legacy. And so this first meeting had certain formative words ringing about it between us. They were words like interdisciplinary, collaborative, incubating, collective, responsive, performative. These were things that these were sort of the adjectives that we were dreaming together. And it was the beginning of a kind of months of co-thinking with William, in which I was asked and given the opportunity to, and took the initiative to, begin to have multiple conversations from that moment onwards with as many players in the arts industries across the disciplines as I could, to try and understand that if Johannesburg needed an arts institution, a new one right now, what was it that this institution would be so that it would meet the needs of artists practicing in Johannesburg? And so these conversations took many forms. They took hundreds of one-on-one conversations with everybody from the directors of the main museums, the professors at the universities, the heads of the biggest galleries that function within the biennials, to collectives of artists working in the underground and working in unofficial ways. And then we collated those conversations and invited all of those individuals into a series of lunches, which happened on Friday afternoons, in which 20 people around a table having lunch together would debate and discuss. And we tried to make those lunches as diverse as they could possibly be between the disciplines and between the kinds of roles that people fulfilled. And with that came the growth of our understanding of what the space will become and what we aim for the space to be. We had this kind of deep privilege because William had agreed to fund the beginning of the life of the center in building an institution in the same way we intuitively build an artwork, which is piece by piece, bit by bit, to try something. When it doesn't work, to let it rest. When it has momentum, to pursue that. And that is still the way the center's working 5-6 years later. It was during these months of co-thinking and in the kind of collecting of people's opinions and needs that William shared a Tswana proverb with me. William is a great follower of the linguist, journalist, politician, translator, and enormous intellect, Sol Plaatje, who lived in the early 1900s in South Africa and who wrote many astonishing pieces of text and books. And one of these books is a small little blue book called Setswana Proverbs and Literal Translations and Their European Equivalents, in which he had collected 700 odd Setswana proverbs and translated them into the literal translation and then the kind of European equivalent of the translation. And one of these proverbs in its literal translation goes, "If the good doctor can't cure you, find the less good doctor." And it resonated very strongly. As he shared it, it was this kind of poignant description of artistic process. The thing that we all know and understand, the magic that happens in the studio or on the stage or in the processes of devising together, where there is a reason you're catalyzed into a state of making. It's usually the big idea. It's the thing that wakes you up at 3 a.m. It's the thing that bubbles in your tummy. It's the thing that is a perfect being in your mind's eye. And then you start to want to bring it into the world. You need to birth this idea. And you share it. You share it via words with a collaborator. You share it by attempting to manifest it with a paintbrush onto a canvas. You share it by trying to compose it into a piece of music on your instrument. And in those first steps of sharing, the perfect, solid, touchable first idea starts to crack and waver. Things that you didn't anticipate happen to it. You're unable to articulate it as accurately out of your mouth as it sits within your mind's eye. And the frustration of the artistic process begins. What the center is advocating for, and what we all know as artists, is in those moments, there are these things that we recognize immediately that we didn't know, but we immediately recognize as special. And in fact, what the work is about. And they're often reminders of your entire past and your trajectory and the thing that you keep coming back to. And so the center's saying, as an institution, we need to be dedicated to the difficulty of those processes as the artist is themselves. And rather than expect the artist to write a proposal on paper, then make the artwork as according to what the proposal said, and finally write a report that matches the proposal, and tick that off as valid art making, is completely absurd. The fact that you would have the idea to write a work that was already finished begs the question, why make the work in the first place? Why go through the process of making the artwork? Why manifest it if we already know what it is? And so we were in a space of wanting to pursue those less good ideas and to see whether experimentally as a space we could methodologically and philosophically develop an approach for that. We also kind of came to a really interesting solution in understanding what my role would be, because William has of course an enormously busy career. He's been essential and seminal to every moment of the development of the Center for the Less Good Idea, but he couldn't take it on himself. He needed somebody like me to help with the momentum and the giving of energy, and the finding of people to get this institution going. And so whilst debating what my role was, we started to know what it wasn't. And we started to instinctively understand that we were going to reject typical titles that sit within artists' institutions, because if we didn't reject them in the naming, we would forget to reject them in the process. And we would fall into the habit that so many institutions do, which is about division, it's about blocking and defining, it's about determining, it's about reporting, and essentially it's about finding a formula that works. And that formula might be magnificent. It might work the first 5 times in the most beautiful ways. But if at some point, a formula will translate into limiting, and a formula will begin to gatekeep what is being said and who is allowed to say it. And so the center was interested in saying, in our naming of ourselves, we would even reject the kinds of definitions that exist within existing arts institutions or any organizations or institutions. And so we made up a word. Well, we borrowed it. We borrowed the word animateur from French. We liked the fact that it almost reminded us of an amateur, not because we were interested in me being a continual bungler of things, although that was also allowed, but because, which is the kind of more common English interpretation of amateur, but in fact, because the root meaning of amateur is that an amateur is a passionate lover of a thing in its infancy and is interested in giving that thing in its infancy life. And so the animateur is that person responsible for giving the center life, but not for determining what that life is about, for giving it momentum, for pulling on threads of networks that exist out there, and then for allowing the artists the freedom and the impulse to develop within that space. So at this point, I wanted to share with you some moments that we've put together. We have an enormously talented team of cinematographers, and can you see that film?
Yes.
Still photographers and editors at the center. And so I wanted to just share with you, this is about 20 minutes, and I just want to ask Bashak how much more time we have still, because we're headed for 12. When are we officially?
I mean, the class ends at 1 officially,
right.
But generally generally the guests are leaving 12:30, but you're allowed to use this time till 1, of course.
No, that's fine. I think we've got, this is about 23 minutes. I'm going to stop and start a little bit in it. And then I'm going to share a last little moment. So I think we'll be able to meet around 12:30, 12:40 as a closing time. So these are the moments of making that I wanted to collate because I find them particularly inspirational as I look back and reflect on how different works at the center were made. And so, can you hear that?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear it.
Share with you some of the first moments in our first season. There you see a composer and performer, Nklankla Mahlangu. We met Nklankla Mahlangu because he also had a kind of a day job as the director of an a cappella male choir called Pupuma Love Minus. So this male choir practice a form of Zulu music called isiskatamia. And it comes out of migrant workers, Zulu migrant workers, using often traditional Zulu compositions. But isiskatamia translates directly into sing low, step light. And it's an incredibly interesting form of music making, which has to do with gentle, slight, subtle gestures and singing, which is a combination of whispering and tongue movement. And a lot of the time it's thought about in relation to the fact that during the apartheid years in South Africa, Black men were not allowed to gather more than 10. It was seen as an ultimate threat to the state and the beginning of a protest. So practicing one's traditional music was in fact a threat. These migrant workers would often be housed in hostels, and these hostels, which were male only, is where a lot of these compositions were developed, so that the people, the security and police manning the hostels would not be aware of what was being developed as an art form. Nklankla was invited with Pupuma Love Minus into the season by the choreographer Gregory Manqoma. And Gregory brought 2 contemporary dancers with him. We see here Tulani Chauke and another dancer, Ngolisile Bangwana, who joined the choir. And these are first sort of tests where Gregory brought the challenge to Nklankla and said, what happens if I ask you to take away the traditional Zulu compositions that you know and love, and I ask you to respond to bolero, a completely foreign composition from Russia. And let's see what you do with your mouths, what you do with your tongues, and how the dancers begin to interpret it. So the next few moments, you'll see the development of that thinking as and when it happened.
With the mic or without with the mic? Okay, with the mic. Okay, well, welcome. Welcome to the Center for the Less Good Idea. This is day one of its operation of the center, the first day of the workshop in which we are looking at making material or devising material for the first set of performances in March next year. Very often when one does a project, whether it's a painting or a drawing or a piece of music or a film or a piece of theater, one has a very clear first idea, and it seems like such a good idea. Let's follow this idea, and this is going to be the piece. And that's the beginning. And then you actually start the work, which is to say, it's no longer something you're writing in a proposal or on a sheet of paper, but you're on the stage, you're with the dancers, You're with the piece of paper actually writing the poem. And in that process, different things start to happen. And new ideas emerge from the physical activity of writing, of moving, of dancing, of listening, that you hadn't thought of when you had the first idea. And these things that happen in the process of making are what I would call the secondary or the less good idea.
Take 6.
God is love, tender mercies, me every morning, back in the field, April morning, vision grass, nothing but the larks pick it up. Out into this world, tiny little thing before its time, and a God for what? Girl? Yes, tiny little girl. Into this, out into this, before her time, God-forsaken, whole, cold, no matter, parents unknown, unheard of, hearing vanished, thin air, no sooner buttoned up his breeches, she's similarly, 8 months later, almost to the tick, so no love, spared that.
So it's at this point that I want to share how, for example, in our first season, we met somebody like Nklanhla Mahlangu as a director of the choir, but through his directing began to understand what an enormously interesting composer and choreographer he was. And so when we came to building the second season, 6 months later, we invited Nklanhla back into the space. And we said to him, what is that project that you've always wanted to do, but not been able to, where the kind of practical components of the project have been a barrier or a resistor to having it made possible? And so he shared with me this idea of a piece that he was wanting to make which he had titled himself Inyangeni, which means kind of on the moon. And it's about a vertical journeying. And essentially he was wanting to experiment with a collection of dancers and vocalists, with a beatboxer, with poets, on a kind of a vertical journeying in a piece that is about ascension. And so it was very simple for us as the center to say, how interesting that in your career so far, that's been a barrier. What would it be for us to just simply install vertical scaffolding used on the construction sites just outside our space in the workshopping and theatre spaces, and for you to play and practice and develop on that. And so this was very exciting for Nklanhla, and it became the setting for the second season, where you'll start to see the way the different artists interacted and responded to the provocation of scaffolding in the space.
I call them prompts. I'm not sure, they've been called shorts, but these mini, small descriptions of small theatrical worlds, basically, is what I was going for. I just found that there was a reoccurring, the things that reoccurred were things like descriptions of space, descriptions of time, mood, sound, and the idea was that they were really quite loosely describing some kind of theatrical world in which things may or may not happen. They have no, I wrote them without real purpose beyond their writing, so I'm really interested in how they might exist here, because they have no agenda yet.
It's nothing to be afraid of.
Those who fight back. This song is dedicated to women.
So I'm going to stop there and move into a sort of final segment of what I wanted to share with you. That moment between Tony Miyambo and Billy Langer, both performers and artists, playwrights, was really interesting. It, like many of the moments we cut together quickly across different seasons, was a moment of play, one that didn't have a particular purpose or a particular outcome necessarily, and yet one that remains significant for the artists and for ourselves. In watching that moment where the two of them had both picked up a kind of old trumpet sitting in the room and decided to build this frustration, there was this sort of visual, visceral metaphor happening for me as I began to understand more and more what the relationships are between artists and the institutions tasked with holding them. So if I move over and show you how this particular piece developed, but remained a peripheral, complete expression in a season where we decided to take the loose ends of much that was discovered in the processes and the incubators and the workshops towards the season, and to stage them as something of a surplus, knowing that they're not full, entire, polished, resolved, and commodifiable elements. They are, in and of themselves, significant expressions. And so we'll watch this minute of expression, and then I'll share with you a love letter that I've recently been writing collaboratively with a choreographer and friend. So at this point, as I said, I wanted to share with you a collaboration that I've been working on this year. It's with the choreographer and dancer, filmmaker, DeVille Cohen, who's based in New York. And DeVille had some time and produced a project in 2019 at the Center for the Less Good Idea. He reached out to me late last year and he said he's in a space where he's slowly but surely developing a company, a dance company, which he calls Hand to Mouth. And as he reflects on what this dance company will be and what it'll do, he keeps coming back to the moments that he remembers so well at the Center for the Less Good Idea, recognizing that there was something in the relationship between himself and the institution that afforded him a particular opportunity to invent and gave him a particular momentum as an artist. And so he asked me if I would help him and collaborate with him on a series of happenings, from texts to video dance works to eventually an installation, which we'll be building in New York. And our dialogue initially had the kind of interesting, our correspondence had the quality of a kind of a love letter. But we realized that it was not a love letter to one another. It was a love letter to holding. And it was a love letter to recognizing the responsibility that an institution has. And so It was with Billy and Tony and their mad screaming in mind that I discovered the metaphor of a donkey. And I wrote this at first. This love letter is about a donkey. The donkey is desperate. The donkey is desperate because the monumental amphitheater built to hold her work has no mechanisms for holding her. The donkey, one sec. The donkey is desperate because the arena is not about her, is about her, but not for her. The Colosseum's cogs have no capacity for her processes. She is the muse within the museum, but she is not invited to the cocktail party. She is asked to be there, to be exposed there, to entertain the cream, but sadly there is no coinage for this concert. It has already been spent on the heavy gram, high gloss invitation cards. Her rigorous strategies, processes, methodological approaches developed by trial and error go unseen, unheard. Her commitment and passion are taken for granted and sometimes taken advantage of. It is impossible to be more vulnerable than she is. Her body, her thoughts, her questions, and her ideas are all laid bare as she is easily consumed at the same time as the cheap, fancy cocktail platters and expensive, bad wine. If the Colosseum looked more closely, it might recognize the cracks on her surface as the web of scars they truly are. Those cracks hold records of brave attempts and necessary risks. With some wisdom and better muscle memory, some damages could have been prevented. Those battle scars are also a record of previous personal and institutional failures and absence of support, resulting so often in the lack of a safe, soft landing ground. So I skip a bit in this text, in this letter, and DeVille writes directly to me, I enjoy thinking about my time at the center as a time in which I was held. It brings to light the ongoing instability and risks. My relationship to security is in its absence. I can't look back at many situations where there was security, provided or cultivated, on a financial or an emotional level. The interesting thing about an absence, as opposed to a deficit, is that a deficit can register a lack, and out of need or desire, create a placeholder for what is missing. Absence is a void, an unregistered scarcity. It is not a shortage of a thing. It is its non-existence. And I reply to him by saying, the fungus is thriving. He took root and discovered himself in a warm and welcoming habitat. His mushrooming is due to his ability to absorb the nourishment found within his current abode. In an interdependent and effervescent dance with the space, he discovers a fermenting. Parts of himself proliferate and relish the culture of the room. He reciprocates and a menage a trois flourishes. So these are just snippets of our love letter to Holding. We end it by saying, Dear Colosseum of cold, hard ground, this love letter actually means a breakup. We need to break up so that we can be with each other. The donkey removes herself from the ill-fitting structures that failed to hold her. She refuses to be rejected into definitions of inside and outside. She is always at the center. And so this is the impulse, is to say, as artists, and as people within institutions, and as people who may well start institutions, and as individuals who can teach institutions, what are the tools that we might come with? When I imagine a metaphorical tool belt that I'm holding as I enter my studio, as I enter collective spaces of making, and as I enter the institution, I have 4 tools which have descriptions for use attached to them. And these are the tools that I try to constantly hold. They are less used, and yet I find seminal to democratizing, decolonizing, and really shifting the ways that institutions function for us. The first is an instrument of instability. Its definition for use is when circumstances of collective, collaborative art making recognize the physical space as a seminal teammate, there is often a tendency to shift what exists in the mind's eye of individuals in the room to what might exist for the collective. By exposing and sharing thinking to the room, singular ideas are transformed into collective actions. This physical spatial recognition has the tendency to demand a rigor that sharpens and simultaneously complexifies. It loosens the boundaries between an idea and an action, the inside and the outside, and it sets in motion a necessary destabilizing force that tends to make the experience of collective making richer. The next tool would be a displacement device. When circumstances of collective, collaborative art making seek to displace the components in the room, be they the individuals, the spaces, the ideas, or the approaches, new possibilities arise. A deliberate and well-held process of displacing can make visible peripheral thinking. Formulated and clear questions become foggy. Developed and confident structures reveal cracks. Authorities in the room slip towards not knowing. These new states can reveal tensions, inspire risk-taking, and ultimately notice the full presence of each individual as an equal maker. The mechanism that is disorganization. When circumstances of collective collaborative art making appreciate that assumed and inherited structures and procedures are not always generative, fertile, or apt, it allows for a kind of experimenting with organizing that comes from thinking through doing. It opens a gap for the unexpected to slip inside, and it turns its focus from the central to the marginal. The implement that is unknown. When circumstances of collective, collaborative art making welcome the unknown, and even the unknown that is never knowable, the acts of ranking and grading become absurd and might dissolve. In turn, unpredicted partnerships form, and with them simultaneously seemingly serendipitous discoveries are made. So in my reflections on what it is to be an individual tasked with the responsibility of giving momentum to an institution, and at the same time, an individual who is in the process of making their own art, I've come to understand animateuring as a kind of a radical role, a role in which I have to grow in a constant state of not knowing. It means that the space that holds us needs to hold a culture of empathy, intimacy, and trust. A space that values questioning and risk-taking also needs to encourage honesty and self-awareness. Rather than insisting that artists are good or right, it simply asks artists to be present. It seeks to be a safe space for vastly different artists to come together. Its rigor comes not from a critical stripping of one another's ideas, but rather from acknowledging the fragility of ideas and making the work vulnerable by exposing and sharing it in all of its states of growth with others. Essentially, at the Center for the Less Good Idea, we have been able to think about the physical spaces as our personal spaces. These are spaces that now hold our collective emotional memory. It's a memory of over 500 artists to date. And what is significant is that I and William and others responsible for the space are just one of those artists. And so I'm going to end there at 12:30 and say that I'm very happy for those who want to continue and ask some questions to still be here in dialogue with you.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn. It was really nice. I was thinking while listening to you, what would be the first immediate 3 keywords that you can attach to Octopus program?
So for sure, there's the collective and this development and sharing of ideas in their incubation. So I think that collective and incubatory is extremely important. But the other thing that I think that is essential that the Octopus program does is the reaching out of tentacles into networks. These institutions, the 10 of them that are involved alongside the 10 of you, are no less or more important to the success and the health of the octopus and the organism as you are as individuals. They should simply represent holding spaces, networks, and threads that pull far and wide across the world. I think that for me is my understanding of what the invention of the Octopus Project by Bashak is. It's about being able to understand that we develop through dialogue, conversation, and testing with one another. That's when ideas are spawned into the world. And the institutions of the world, in particular art institutions, of course, in whatever form they might take and for whatever function they might have, ultimately need to remember their responsibility, which is that they are holding spaces for you, but the artist sits centrally to that.
No, but as you know, I always think about the institutions in a way that they are always dynamic as well. Even the ones that are more structured and bureaucratic and so forth, they're always being shaped with the individuals that are involved to those institutions. And of course, there are hundreds of things that we should resist and we should be opposed to. But at the same time, once you are out of the system, you are useless. This is what I believe. So I really believe that you have to be attaching to a system, even if you are against this, in order to shift it. And I think like this is the also with the arts, it is more possible because you have other tools of resisting, you have other tools of shifting, and you have other tools of changing not even the ideas, but changing the perception. And once you change the perception, once I think you can start really changing and shifting them.
Yes, hey, thank you so much for the talk. It was very inspiring. I think I would have maybe like several questions, but something I was like left thinking about you. This is a detail you told that when you were starting the Center for Less Good Ideas, you organized these lunches for different people from different institutions. And I thought that was like a great idea to ask and listen what is needed. So I was left thinking that how was that? How did you navigate with that? So you describe you try to have like diverse conversations. So if there were like different kind of needs and or opinions, so how did you solve that kind of like that situation?
Yeah, I think in the course of lunches, we weren't necessarily seeking to solve or get everybody on the same page. It was about a opportunity to express what they thought the landscape of Johannesburg needed. And so it was at the end of the day, we had a series of 20 lunches, and we were able to collate our kind of findings and see where there were many similarities, and particularly where people of different disciplines, so where people in contemporary dance and theatre and visual arts were all saying something similar, but expressing it within their own kind of genre or their own language about what the needs are. We asked the same set of questions at the beginning of every lunch. We asked, what is it that isn't happening in Johannesburg right now and that you would like to see happening? And so we were asking about the gaps. And then we were asking about what is happening outside of the formal spaces. And can you share that with us? Can you introduce us as far as and wide as possible to what is happening outside of the understood kind of formal spaces of the universities and the museums and the galleries? And what was very interesting to discover was many individuals working within the formal spaces had deep knowledge and appreciation of what was happening outside of the spaces. In fact, sometimes they would be individually supporters of that, but had never thought to bring them into the institution. Because, because we all tend to sort of begin to behave within the formula and within the rules, even when the rules are unwritten. And so those dialogues and conversations were extremely interesting, and it was more a kind of a collating of it. And then knowing that we were going to start the building of the center, which the basic structure of the center is that we have 2 core seasons every year. So we make 6-month seasons, which from beginning to end are dialogues which translate into incubative workshops and intensive making periods, where we bring in individuals to the artists that they seek to work with. They might be creative technologists or architects or lighting designers or bronze casters. So we have these making sessions, and then in the final month of the season, we move from a rehearsal and installation phase into a 5-day presentation to public phase. But we're very specific when we communicate with the public and we communicate with the artists. These are not works that are polished and complete and resolved. We couldn't be less interested in producing that. You have the privilege as an audience coming to a festival at the Center for the Less Good Idea of witnessing artists in their thinking. This is a precious thing that you get to see. And so if you see something that looks like a flop, well, congratulations. you've seen an artist in their most vulnerable moment, and you will begin to comprehend how difficult it is. And so it's about also demystifying what it is to produce the art. Of course, there's still the pressure and momentum. Artists don't want to show flops. We did a fascinating thing in the 4th season, which was a collapsed conference. The provocation from the center was to the curators was to say, host a conference as an academic institution would. The topic is performativity. And the only rule is that you're not allowed to deliver a paper, have a panel discussion, or produce a journal article about this. But let's deepen our understanding of what constitutes performativity in South Africa particularly, but also abroad. And during the course of the season, we were discovering things that were testing, and that we were starting to, where there was kind of murmurings and dialogues and discussions around, well, that didn't work. Okay, so we started with, somebody mentioned a kind of metaphorical failure room, and they said, oh, it's fine, just stash that in the failure room. And then somebody else decided, well, actually, I'm going to work with all the failures. And the interesting thing was, once the failures were identified and addressed and given love and attention, many of them flourished to overtake the ideas that were sort of identified collectively as better ideas, and where there was something happening. So I think it's also about knowing that in the building of an institution, we can't begin to know what the answers are. We can't begin to believe that we're going to represent everybody's needs, but we're going to start with a few key things. And that is to say that we're more interested in the collective than the individual right now, philosophically. We're interested in what the collective is saying, rather than what individuals are saying. We're not particularly interested in making a hierarchy of people. So on a very sort of administrative level, one of the rules at the center is everybody who partakes in the season gets paid the same amount. You might be Waleed Raad, who we've had, and you're a complete superstar who moves all around the world. And you might be fresh out of your BA Fine Arts degree, but you've been selected and invited into this process, and everybody is paid the same amount. What you choose to do with what you're paid, and how you choose to commit yourself to that is then your personal choice. The fascinating thing about that decision, and about the decision not to have heavy bureaucratic contracts between artists which stipulate what they have to do and what they have to produce, and rather loose engagement letters that just mention the dates and what they will be paid, and that we would hope that they would be on receiving the payment and committing to the season, that they would be present for these compulsory dates, which is really the incubators, the rehearsals, and the showing. And it's a signed letter that no lawyer has sniffed this letter, right? It's just one that I've written and we send to each artist. As I mentioned, we've worked with over 500 artists, many of whom, I have to say, live in very, very difficult situations, have traumatic pasts, are navigating multiple lives, are having to work in restaurants in order to make the work that they're doing. We have, if I've been disappointed by a person and their level of commitment to the process and to what they bring to the center, 5 times, that's a lot. I don't think I can count it on one hand. And so what the evidence for me is that the desire to make work burns so deeply in the belly of the artist and overrides so many of these processes that are enforced upon us in order to function within a kind of capitalist interpretation of what art constitutes, that those are the things that are in fact hindering rather than facilitating the arts. It's of course up for debate, because at the same time, artists are taken advantage of by institutions, and the contracts that we insist upon as artists are often in an attempt to protect us. So, you know, there are paradoxes here, and it's obviously as per conversation. But I think, Marit, just to come back to your point, because I went sort of on a trajectory, but we knew we wouldn't be able to answer everybody. We were able to distill some primary impulses for ourselves about and kind of approaches for ourselves. And then we hoped that as the center unfolds over its years and over its bit by bit, that we would slowly but surely address a lot of the more obvious desires by certain people in the room. And so one of the things that has been happening that's very interesting is William as an individual, who of course has enjoyed an enormous career and as a result is a very wealthy man, is able to continue funding the center. And that keeps our administration and bureaucracy very light, because he's somebody who couldn't be less interested than in reading a report and doesn't want to see an Excel spreadsheet. He's very trusting of, at the beginning of the process, this is the amount of money that you've got. And at the end of the process, when you've spent it, if I can see the artwork, I know it was worth it. If I can understand the process, if I can understand that it was of value to the artists, I know that it was worth it. One of our strategies, which is a core strategy at the center for reporting, for understanding the value and the impact, is not to write it down, to create a budget spreadsheet, to look at achievables and deliverables, but it's to have in the room a number of camera operators, sound recorders, photographers, and writers. And they are responsible for recording the action. Two things happen there. We start to finally, in the context of South Africa, build a powerful archive of what contemporary South African art looks like, because there's not enough of an archive of that. But we also find that these individuals become mirrors for ourselves as we're processing and as we're working through. We're on a nearly live basis. The next day, you can say to the cinematographer, can I see what we were doing at 3 o'clock yesterday? Because I think there was something interesting there, but I need to step outside of myself. And he'll be able to draw that up and show it. So it's a very useful device. It becomes a kind of more long-term archive, as I said. But it also becomes evidence for all of us that this is worth it. You know, I didn't show you much final product or of the festival. I showed you snippets in the moments of making, but you will have sensed from watching that anything spent on those processes is worth it. It is enlivening and enriching the individuals and the city and the broader art scene, because artists are in a space and they've been given the benefit of the doubt to be pursuing their ideas and testing themselves and their work.
Else? Yeah.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I think what you've been saying throughout the whole session, and maybe also, I don't know if I can talk for the others, but I have a feeling that this silence after your talk is not because nothing or it was confusing, but I think, yeah, I don't know, as Bengo also said, I feel really supported and somehow opened as well. I don't know, and a bit sad, because I think what you've been is so resonating with many things I feel, from the animateur to the idea that then never really happens as you imagine it. And maybe it has to do for me with my background in academics, or my feeling still relatively new to and insecure to being an artist. But why to me it was painful is because the things you say, like, it made me really feel like I want to be there, and I really hope that Octopus can also be this place. But this question of vulnerability, and even in our art university, I think it's a super difficult topic, and I was wondering what role would an artist have there? Because yes, obviously, or I mean, ideally there would be a place where we can be all of this, and where we can focus on the process, and where we don't, like, in my own works, I often feel blocked to even start producing, to even start going from this idea to, I don't have a material that I'm really familiar with. How do I, what do I do? And I think a very big part of this fear to start is not just my not being familiar with a material, but more the fear of this vulnerability, and what will I share, and what do I have to hide, and I don't know. Yeah, I wonder, what role would you say can we take there, or what do you advise?
So interestingly, as somebody who sort of found themselves post my degree and for the first decade of my making, more in the visual art realm and as in the fine art world, and then stumbling back through the center into the performance world, there is something that I think the visual arts, and particularly those that situate them, the visual arts that situates itself in the academy or in the university, seems to forget, which is that we have community. We are each other's community. And that when we are thinking through doing and thinking through speaking and through sharing, there is an opportunity to identify things that we cannot possibly do on our own and just in dialogue with ourselves. And so I think that the collective and the collaborative is a very important answer there. It's about finding your community, finding people you trust, finding others who are also artists, and developing loose relationships and collaborations where you know that you're there to hold one another. You become deeply familiar with one another's material interests, aesthetic outputs, conceptual underpinnings, so that you can continue to grow and develop. You may well collaborate, but you don't have to. But I think that the creating of communities around you, of people that you trust, is important. Some of them may develop into more formal institutions themselves. This we know happens, and the artist-led is very significant. But as a visual artist, coming back into the kind of dramatic and theatrical world, which I enjoyed as a child, and again, you know, in primary school and high school, I was always in the plays and I was always on the stage. And yes, I painted and I drew and stuff, but in fact, my passion lay in that space. And so what's interesting is that when I was back in that space, and I remember having this epiphany in season 1, I was in the midst of complete chaos. There were boxers in a boxing ring working with a poet and an opera singer. And then there were these dancers trying to kind of interrupt them. And there was the a cappella choir behind me. And I was listening to that. And it all happens in the same space. And I felt like I was in this kind of deja vu dream of recognizing, oh my God, I've found my community again. I have people that I can share things with, that understand what I'm thinking, and I am able to be vulnerable with them. And once you're able to be vulnerable, and from that point of vulnerability with a safe space for failure, is what the center often talks about itself as. A safe space to be stupid, right? That will elicit a more rigorous, and I think a project that can perhaps withstand the less kind world. Because I absolutely understand what you're saying, and vulnerability we have to be very careful with, because also as artists, I think we tend to not only expose ourselves, but then expose ourselves to some of the most kind of cruel spaces in an attempt to shift the world. I think it's about building your community, identifying those people that you trust, who you have a kind of intellectual and a heartfelt connection with, and being there as mirrors for each other. Having said that, you know, I'm not exactly sure who and when, but the center, of course, is a seminal collaborator in this. And at some point in the course of next year, some of you will be with us in the spaces. And, you know, I think that that's very exciting for us too, as a season is in the build. You will be one of the artists in the space who has the autonomy to make your own work, to develop, but also to reach out to those in the room that interest you, and to pursue your projects in that way. Mm-hmm. I envy you all going through this process together. I'm sure it must be exciting to be also able to develop your various projects, and to be sharing it with each other over this extended period of time. I can't wait to see the process, and yeah, to dip in and out. But also I'm available. You know, I know I've had some one-on-one chats already with some of you, but for those who just want to reach out or want some specific information about the center, you know, I'm happy to also just have some one-on-one emails or Zoom conversations in the coming weeks.
Bronwyn, thank you so much. It was an amazing session, and we are hoping to see you again in our sessions. Thank you, Bronwyn, again.
Bye. Thanks for your kind words. Thanks.
Thank you so much.